I'm Amber Rodriguez, hosting EWC Cultural News Today. I wanted to give you insight on a current issue involving the Native and Indigenous community and the United States Supreme Court with the federal case Howland v. Brackeen. In an attempt to adopt a Navajo and Cherokee boy with his half-sister, the Brackeens, a white Christian family in Texas, are challenging a law that's been in place since 1978 that governs Native children in state foster care. The Indian Child Welfare Act aims to prevent family separation among the Native community and prioritizes placing Native children into Native families and foster homes to reinforce the children's tribal identity and heritage. Take a look at these next pictures from the New York Times of the Brackeens family with the two children and the biological family. Note the difference between family culture and lifestyle. According to the New York Times, in 2018, a federal judge ruled in the Brackeens' favor, declaring that the Indian Child Welfare Act, was unconstitutional, in part, he said, because it was based on race. The case has made its way to the Supreme Court that will be heard in October of this year, but now it has been consolidated to several other cases brought by the state of Texas, Louisiana, Indiana, and individual plaintiffs with the same argument that the policy is race-based and discriminates against non-Native parents looking to adopt. Tribes defending ICWA and other supporters expressed placement preferences are political, not racial. They also expressed if ICWA is overturned, it will have a negative consequences for Native rights and contribute to assimilation of Native communities. The ruling could potentially change the protection for Native children and families with a law that's been in place for over 40 years. And the United States has had a long, dark history of disregard to the Native community, especially with family relationships and children. In 1879, the federal government created Indian boarding schools in which Native children undertook mass assimilation of their culture. Their hair was cut, their names were changed, their language was unspoken, and all customs were stripped. Reported years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, along with other horrific acts, resulted in the deaths of Native children. According to AP News, at least 500 children died at such schools, but that number is expected to reach the thousands or tens of thousands as more research is done. The United States isn't the only country at fault for its mistreatment of Native children. AP News also reported that more than 150,000 Native children in Canada were forced to attend government-funded Christian schools from the 19th century until the 1970s in an effort to isolate them from the influence of their homes and culture. The aim was to Christianize and assimilate them into mainstream society, which previous Canadian governments considered superior. According to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, after decades of abuse, on July 25th of this year, Pope Francis made an apology statement to the public about the Indian boarding schools. Pope Francis stated, "I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously. I humbly beg for forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the indigenous peoples. The Indian boarding schools are just one example of traumatic events in history to the Native indigenous community by white Christian beliefs. In addition to the Indian boarding schools, from 1958 to 1967, a federal program called the Indian Adoption Project promoted the adoption of Native children from Western states by non-Native adoptive families in the East. A press release in 1966 from the Bureau of Indian Affairs normalized the removal of Native children from their homes in this statement. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, and 206 more are brightening the homes and lives of 172 American families, mostly non-Indians who have taken the Indian wives as their own. Congress found between 25 to 35% of Native children around the country were being taken from their homes, and that 85 to 95% of those kids ended up in non-native homes or institutions. These statistics, along with the history of cultural genocide in Indian boarding schools, sparked ICWA to be formed in 1978 to recognize this mistreatment, abuse, and protect the best interests of Indian children by promoting the stability and security of tribes, Native families as well. Assimilation and cultural genocide is not a new concept to the Native and Indigenous people. Their communities are still healing from their tragic losses of this past. Their communities are still healing from the tragic losses of this past and its remnants today. Some non-Native people, like Pope Francis, are recognizing this dark history and the conversation of assimilation forced by white Christians. To put this cultural genocide into a deeper message, Sandy Whitehawk, a Sikangu Lakota adoptee from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, stressed the importance of Native identity from her experience of cultural rejection growing up. In this quote graphic posted by Protect ICWA, she stated, "When we grow up in a white home, in a white community, that's all we see and know. We don't know anything about being Native, and most white people don't know anything about who we are. You don't have your image mirrored back to you in any way. That's a distortion as you develop your identity." Sandy Whitehawk was 18 months when she was removed from her home and placed with white missionaries that was over 400 miles from her reservation. And now the white Christian family of the Brackens are attempting to adopt 2 Native children. This is a current example and reflection of the years behind the purpose and goal of ICWA. The decades behind this long fight of this law to protect Native children and families is in the fate of the Supreme Court this fall. I'm Amber Rodriguez, your host for EWC Cultural News Today, and this is the Indian Child Welfare Act.
You've been listening to EWC Cultural News Today, hosted by Amber Rodriguez. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.